brain scientist. We each have 5 scientists that kind of set up a camp inside of our brains, and both brains here, that I want to address with you. This is going to be paramount to understand as we move into a process called tactical processing, whereby you're going to learn how to self-soothe and how to process through grudges, grievances, and yesterday's trauma. So the 5 scientists are biased scientist, unscrupulous scientist, and this is all inside of your models and definitions book, the responsible scientist, the curious scientist, and the quintessential scientist. So let's go over what all 5 of them do. Number 1, we're going to start with the biased scientist. This scientist selectively chooses data that fits the hypotheses, ignoring everything else. What's the hypotheses? I have no worth. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable, or it's always my fault. That's a hypothesis. What you're going to do now is the biased scientist will selectively grab data from the environment that surrounds you to verify and to prove you have no worth, to the point that you'll even start sabotaging yourself if you start having success. I've seen couples literally do that. I've watched entrepreneurs go out of their way to sabotage their business because they're going to selectively choose. I have one client, this is real interesting. This client came to me, this is years ago, and he started telling me the challenges that he was going through. At the end of his narrative of what he was explaining, I said, if I didn't know better, I would argue that you experienced the Holocaust and that you were in a concentration camp. And he just looked at me and he goes, my grandparents did. I thought that was interesting. So what we have is a generational skip, and then he picked up the generational transfer of the grandparents' behavioral DNA that helped him, that's improper way of saying it, that caused him to feel anxiety over some of the silliest things, especially regarding his business. Very highly strung, very anxious about everything, and constantly telling himself stories that wasn't true. He would take data and he would try to use that data and selectively pull out information to prove this is why he's at risk right now. That's a biased scientist. The next scientist is the unscrupulous scientist, who ignores the data completely and maintains his or her predictions are reality, immaculate perception. This is also considered the deaf and blind scientist. In other words, if I believe I don't have worth, I will simply go through life emotionally reasoning I have no worth. If I believe that that person's going to offend me, I will automatically guarantee and find a reason or why that person's going to offend me. I just watched a bunch of news last night at my brother's home. That's all politicians are doing, it seems. They're constantly looking for ways to blame the president, blame the Congress, blame the Senate, blame somebody, and they never once question their own assumptions. This is the quintessential who is right at the expense of what is right. What's best for the country? What's best for my constituents? What's best for the overall welfare of the company? When we get so hooked on who is right, it is our biased and or our quintessential scientist that is shutting us down from focusing on all the other data points that are available for us at that time. The next scientist, the responsible scientist, has the ability to change direction and opinion based on the data. Now this is critical because there's 3 of these healthy scientists and they're operating at the subcortical level. If I have a false narrative, let's say I have no worth, and the biased and the quintessential scientist are doing their job, which means I'm going to constantly be at a high alert, amygdala hijack, fragmented. The responsible scientist is there to bring back reality, to start question assumptions. This is what my experience has been. We have to cognitively invite him into that space and say, okay, help us find out what's going on. So in the responsible scientist, we're going to simply say, all right, is there more data here that we can look at? What haven't I seen? What assumptions am I not questioning? Remember, when your awareness is raised, you see the invisible, hear the unheard, and understand the incomprehensible. Because if you don't, they control you. The responsible scientist is saying, there's more data here. There's things here that we haven't seen. And then he turns it over to the curious scientist. The curious scientist focuses on input with the intent to learn and grow. If you understand how the critical faculty works, the reason I say, what if I trust and respect myself? What if I have worth? Is because the question bypasses the critical faculty and puts a different set of data into the mind of the biased and the unscrupulous scientist. When I say, well, what if I could have worth? What if I could be successful? Those two scientists don't know how to handle that because they're very biased, they're selective. They're going to say, well, you can't. I say, well, what if I can? Oh, I never considered that. Oh, so the responsible scientist turns it over to the curious scientist and says, ask the questions. What if I have worth? What if I have civility with boundaries today? What if I respect myself? What if I trust myself? What would that look like? Then the curious scientist turns it over to the quintessential scientist who runs armchair experiments to imagine the world without sensory input. Parentheses, immaculate perception. Put it in different words, the quintessential scientist is going to do an experiment in the imagination on what if I actually have worth? What if I actually believe that I can trust myself and I respect myself? What would that look like? And now I'm going to run an experiment without the false data, the selective data coming in. It's a pure scientific experiment. What if I actually have worth today? And for the next hour, what if I held boundaries? For the next 2 hours, I questioned all assumptions on who is right. And I just focused on what is right. I could be civil with boundaries. You see, what the quintessential scientist does is it starts the healing process. Because if I have an experience in my imagination that I have worth, that I trust myself or I respect myself, it is as though I really had it because my brain can't tell the difference. I actually had that experience. Remember, experiences lead to beliefs, beliefs lead to behavior. I now logged in a set of experiences. And if I continue to practice with mindfulness every morning, because I'm in my foxhole, I'm making this container that's principle-based, so I can change my first half of life toolkit to the second half of life toolkit. The only way I'm going to do that is to constantly have these experiences, not because I'm going to talk to someone who then tells me cognitively, well, you don't have to do that. Because that's crazy. You can't change behavior by talking about behavior. So use the three scientists. The responsible scientist tips it over to start bringing in different data. It's existing data. You haven't always been a failure. The curious scientist is going to ask the what if questions. What if I have worth? What does it look like? And how would that feel? And we're going to cover this in the tactical processing as well. The quintessential scientist is going to run the experiment in the imagination, preferably in mindfulness, because that works so beautifully. And is simply going to say, all right, let me just imagine that. Let me hold a conversation with my wife, my children, my boss, whoever, and let me remain neutral. What does that look like? Process that. Hear the questions, ask the questions, pull in the data, and run that experiment. Those are your 5 brain scientists. When you implement them, and we're going to have this discussion again when we do tactical processing, incredibly powerful. Thanks for listening.